Chapter 7 deals with climate and biodiversity, so basically what determines climate, and then an overview of the terrestrial biomes. So the case study at the beginning of the chapter just emphasizes kind of the three major types of biomes: deserts, grasslands, and forests. And then those are determined by precipitation, and then the types of deserts, grasslands, and forests are then determined by temperature. So nice overview there. Now, 7.1, what factors influence climate? This is dealing with things that maybe you haven't learned a lot about before. So one important distinction to make is that when we're talking about weather, we're talking about what's temperature and precipitation, humidity, things like that over a period of hours or days. Climate, we're looking at norms over a period of at least 3 decades. So always keep that in mind. So ocean currents, global air circulation, those help to distribute heat. When we're talking about air circulation, we have some major types of cells that they're called, which can be seen on the post-it note. The Hadley cells are closest to the equator, then Ferrel cells and polar cells. They're also described in figure 7.3, and these help to explain why some areas receive more precipitation, like along the equator, but then when you get up to around 30 degrees north and 30 degrees south, that tends to be drier air, so there's less precipitation, so that's where we have deserts. So that's one thing that air circulation tends to explain. In figure 7.2, it shows you the ocean currents, the major ocean currents, surface currents that are warm with red and cold with blue. So why is England so mild compared to Canada? If you look on the map, they're roughly the same latitude, but England, Ireland, much more mild, and it's because of that warm ocean current that brings warm water and thus raises the temperature. Upwellings, which will be important later on, these are regions where nutrient-rich water rises to the surface, usually occurs near where the coast is very steep, so where the continental shelf kind of drops off right away. So these are great areas for fishing. Deep ocean currents, which we can see in 7.5. 7.4 is showing you your convection currents in the air, those air cells that we were just talking about. 7.5 shows you the deep ocean currents. Something really important to remember is that cold and salty water is going to sink, and warm water is less dense, so it will rise up. So this helps to circulate things within the ocean as well. Now, I want you to take a moment. I want you to go to the supplemental section. Supplemental pages 26 and 28. These are towards the end of the book. And this has to do with El Nino. Okay. So if you look here, supplement 7, you do need to know El Nino. I've never seen much on tornadoes or cyclones, but El Nino definitely shows up. So the idea with El Nino, and we'll talk about this in class, is that generally the air patterns move in one way, and so therefore water moves in that way as well. But during an El Nino condition, the wind patterns shift, and that changes the water flow and then changes precipitation and droughts, etc. in areas. So El Nino continues on to supplemental page 28. Definitely read over this section, okay, and bring questions to class. Now back to chapter 7. Excuse me. We've got our greenhouse gases again, super important in the troposphere. So remember carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, water, all greenhouse effects. Greenhouse gases. The greenhouse effect is good, okay? It helps to maintain surface temperatures. But as we combust fossil fuels, deforestation, the growth of certain crops, that's increasing the amount of greenhouse gases. And then we get into microclimates. So these are little like regional areas that have their own climate. A great example of this is the urban heat island effect, where cities tend to be much warmer because they have increased concrete and surfaces that are going to hold on to the heat. there might be more air pollution due to traffic, construction, etc. And then figure 7.6, the last figure in the first section of this chapter, deals with the rain shadow effect. Definitely know this. This explains the other major areas where we see deserts. It helps to explain why we can have, on one side of the mountain range, you can have very lush forests, and on the other side, very little, and that's the rain shadow effect. All right, then 7.2, we start to get into our different biomes. Now, there are a lot of different biomes that we could look at. We'll look at these later on. Know the general locations of our major biomes. Like, you should know generally deserts are found at 30 degrees north and south. You should know where tropical rainforests are going to be found near the equator, whereas temperate deciduous forests are going to be found usually between 30 and 60, both north and south. And so there are, depending on what book you're using, what resource you're looking at, there are a lot of different potential lists of biomes, which is why figure 7.9 does a nice job of explaining kind of a general idea of how these biomes are situated in terms of both temperature, which we can see on the left, and then precipitation on the bottom. All right, so major types of deserts: tropical, temperate, and cold. Generally, they have very, very, very low rainfall, but the temperatures can range, hence tropical versus cold. These climatograms, which we can see on page 155, show you the temperature with a line, and then precipitation is shown with a bar graph. So we can see with all of our deserts, very low precipitation. The Science Focus does a really nice job of explaining some adaptations that we see of organisms that live in deserts. And this is one place, normally populations are clumped, but this is one place where we often see uniform plant distribution because of that limiting factor of water. The vegetation is very sparse. It tends to be drought resistant. The soil is nutrient poor because there's a lack of rainfall, and there's slow nutrient cycling. Okay. Grasslands get more rainfall than the deserts, but usually not enough rainfall to support large trees. And again, they come in 3 general categories based on temperature. So tropical grassland or savanna, temperate grassland, which here in America we call the prairie, and then the cold grassland or Arctic tundra. Okay. So in tropical grasslands, we've got seasonal rain, grazing animals, drought-resistant plants again. Temperate grassland, this is where we have our best soil, very nutrient-rich, tend to get tall grasses. Fires are very important in temperate grasslands because they help to prevent tree growth and they help to maintain the soil health by returning nutrients. And then the Arctic tundra, which some books would refer to as a desert, so this can get a little tricky. Really large variations in sunlight depending on the time of the year. We have permafrost, so where the soil is actually frozen for all or at least a portion of the year. Lichens and mosses are some of the dominant species, migratory animals, and the soil tends to be very nutrient poor. Okay. We also have alpine tundra, which if you've ever hiked up a mountain and you get to the part where above the tree line, that's the alpine tundra. So it has some similarities to the Arctic tundra in that you get lichens and mosses and not a lot of animals living up there. Another type of grassland is the chaparral, also known as the temperate shrubland. So think about Southern California or the Mediterranean coast. So we get low-growing shrubs. Often the plant species are adapted to fires. Some of them depend upon fires to release their seeds. They have more moisture and more precipitation in the winter, but the winters are pretty mild, and the summers tend to be very hot and dry. And then our forests get the most rainfall, so that can support large trees. Tropical, temperate, and then the coniferous forests, or boreal or taiga. They have so many different names. So tropical rainforest, this is where we have our highest biodiversity on land, high net primary productivity, lots of layers, like the canopy, for example. The soil is nutrient poor, and that's something that a lot of people don't realize. Most nutrients are found inside organisms, okay, because of all of that biodiversity. And all that heavy rainfall helps to increase decomposition and also the leaching of nutrients further down into the soil where it's not in the upper layers that can be reached. Tropical rainforests are very much threatened by deforestation, not necessarily for building materials, but mostly for cattle grazing and farming. Temperate deciduous forest, hello New England. We have distinct seasons, like lovely fall right now. The population tends to be, or precipitation tends to be pretty evenly distributed throughout the year, so there's no wet season, dry season. Broadleaf trees. Nutrients tend to be pretty rich because of all of the leaves that fall, and then as those decompose, that helps to increase the nutrients in the soil. And then the boreal forest, or taiga, full of coniferous trees. These are found in subarctic regions. The soil tends to be very thin, more nutrient poor, and it tends to be acidic because of all those pine needles that fall. When we think about mountains, you can apply the theory of island biogeography back from chapter 4 here as well, because mountains kind of represent their own little habitats within other areas. So species that are found only there will, depending on how, if it's a mountain range versus an isolated mountain, that will make a difference. And then remember endemic species, which were found in only one location. Okay. And then some cool info here on page 164 about mountains and their role in the water cycle. They provide 58% of the world's population with fresh water, especially important in parts of Asia with like the Himalayan mountains, etc. And then page 165 has some great examples of how humans are impacting terrestrial ecosystems. And that is the end of chapter 7.